All right, folks, welcome back. I hope you had a lovely break. My name is Meredith Broussard. I'm a data journalism professor at NYU in the Department of Journalism. And I also have a new book out called Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. So I'm going to be leading our next conversation about solutions to misinformation. So our panelists are Alexander Kopek to my left. He is an assistant professor at Yale, and he's in the political science department. And we also have Magdalena Wojciszak, who is an associate professor at the University of California at Davis, who's in the communication department. And we are going to be talking about, okay, what do we do? All right. Alex, you want to start us off?
This is a tremendous amount of pressure on this last panel. We've been building up to what are we going to do about all this. So I apologize for the inevitable failure that we will present unto you. So I study persuasion in response to political information. And I do that using survey experiments where you bring people into the survey environment. I'm going to measure some demographic characteristics about them. Then I'm going to randomly assign them to either see a piece of information or not. I then compare their attitudes afterwards to find out what the effect of this information on their attitudes is. I think it's important to just state, this is how I know. I know about what I'm about to tell you because I did random assignment. So this is an experiment in which I've controlled whether or not people see this information. So I've done dozens and dozens of these survey experiments, and I just want to tell you 3 things that I've learned from doing these survey experiments. The first thing is that people update their attitudes in the direction of the information that you present them. So this is the not counterintuitive result. This is the normal, boring, hard to publish, but nevertheless, really important result, which is that people update their views in the direction of information. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that these updates are small. Of course they're small. If they were big, that would mean that every time you encounter a new piece of information, you're just flopping around, right? So these are small. What do I mean by small? If you care about standard deviations, it's 1/10 of a standard deviation. What's that in percentage point terms? It's about a 5 percentage point difference. So imagine the control group agrees with the statement at a rate of 50%. The treatment group is going to agree with the statement at a rate of 55%. Of course, there's variation from issue to issue. There's variation on whether the source is of a particular kind, et cetera. Those differences are small relative to this. The main thing that we're describing, which is that I give you a piece of persuasive information, and you update your views in the direction of that information. Okay, so that's point 2. In the direction, and it's small. Point number 3, and this is the one that nobody believes me on, but I really hope that you believe me because it's really, really true, is that it's not different for different kinds of people, okay? So Republicans and Democrats are different from one another in their baseline points of view, but they both update by about 5 percentage points. So we get what I call persuasion in parallel, right? So they start out separate, they are both persuaded, and they end up still disagreeing with one another, but the information was persuasive to both groups. That pattern holds for partisan groups, young versus old, black, white, rich, poor, well-educated, not well-educated. So when I look to see whether or not there are differences in treatment response to information, the answer is, yeah, sure, maybe a little bit, but we're talking about that 5-point difference, and it's plus or minus 1 for these different groups, right? So we should not be expecting large differences in response to information. Okay, so those 3 points about information. This is a panel about misinformation. So the question is, does misinformation behave in any way differently from information? And the answer from, so the bank of experiments on misinformation is about 10 deep. Maybe there's 12. We don't know as much about it as we do about information, but the summary result from the 10 or 12 that have been done is that, yeah, no, you tell somebody a lie, they believe the lie a little bit more. How much more? I don't know, about 5 percentage points, right? Okay. So if you tell them a rumor, they believe the rumor a little bit more. You tell them a falsehood about some government policy. Okay. So they update in the direction of the rumor. It's a small effect, and it's about the same for everyone. So far as we can tell on what misinformation does to people, it does what information does. And that makes sense because how are you supposed to know what's true and false? you don't have access to the truth. That's why you're reading the article, right? Okay. So the bad news is that we are all very susceptible to misinformation. Like news headlines every day are getting revised, and I'm sure that we have all believed something that has then been corrected by a newspaper, and like that's just part of the way that this works. What about corrections to rumors? Well, it turns out that corrections work just the same as every other kind of information. When like the experiment is, first I expose you to a rumor, and then I expose you to a correction to that rumor. The people who are corrected don't believe the lie at a lower rate. By how much more? I don't know. It's about 5 percentage points, right? So the corrections also work like information. So there's a lot of discussion about what's the best kind of correction to do. Right? People are like, oh, don't repeat the lie, or you have to give an alternative plausible story. Right? There are these. My understanding from my reading of those 10 or 12 experiments is that the differences across correction strategies are overblown. Right? That it's that 5 percentage point difference, and then we're talking about small variations at the margin about what strategy is more effective versus another. And if you imagine the data requirements of being able to distinguish a 5-point effect from a 4-point effect, you need a sample size that is much larger than what political scientists are bringing to bear. Okay, so I think it's great for us to iterate on what kinds of corrections are, like what's the best way to write a fact check story, or what's the best way to write a story that's correcting misinformation in general. It's great for us to iterate on that. But I think that the main thing is that the most important thing to do is counter the information in whatever way you like, right? Future experiments should absolutely run a horse race across these things, but so far the extant evidence is that corrections work. Do some corrections work better than others? Open question. I want to end on what this means for the way that our political discourse goes. We often describe people who believe fake news as susceptible to fake news. And that word implies that people are differently susceptible to the introduction of fake news. And I don't think that that is true. I think that we are all approximately equally susceptible. And I think it's a way of denigrating our political opponents to call them, oh, those stupid people over there, they believe that thing that's demonstrably false, right? We all believe a bunch of false things. We are all susceptible to information. They are also susceptible to correction. And so I think that that's a bit of dignity that we can give to political opponents, that they are convincible, and we should take up the task of doing that. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alex. All right, Magdalene?
Great, thank you. So I will be disagreeing to some extent here, and I will first outline what I think are the challenges to the efforts to curb the spread and the acceptance of misinformation. And I will later propose some ideas, and one of them will be pretty controversial, I believe. So first, the challenges. So first, the various strategies aimed at curbing or correcting misinformation rely on the assumption that people care about truth. That if only we give people more information, if we only put more facts or evidence out there, then everything will be better and different. And that may not be the case. Because first of all, some citizens do not care about verifiable or objective truth as we would define it. And they use the media, turn on the TV or go online, not necessarily to find that objective information or evidence, but rather to reaffirm their in-group identity, for instance, to see what the opponents are doing, or actually to find support for what they themselves believe to be true, which may not be what is defined as objective truth. And importantly, and that's a point made by Kelly Garrett from Ohio State University at the symposium at Stanford, some people may endorse falsehoods knowing that there's evidence to the contrary. So for example, I know that scientists say that vaccinations are safe, but I choose not to believe that, and I choose not to vaccinate my children anyway. Right? What do we do about that? Is that misinformation? Is it misbelief? How do we craft correction efforts in those situations, for instance? So that's the first challenge. And second, giving people facts or telling them that false information is false does work, but I think that it works, according to research, in situations that are increasingly rare in the current polarized climate. So for instance, research shows that citizens will reject misinformation when it is refuted by unlikely sources. So for example, a situation in which a Republican politician corrects what President Trump has said, or in which Breitbart News corrects what Fox News said, or vice versa. Such corrections work, but are politicians or media organizations likely to correct misinformation coming from within their political in-group? Well, I think it's not very likely, also based on anecdotal observations. Also, and that dovetails on what prior panelists said, appealing to an independent authority is set to work. So for example, we may tell people that Nobel Prize winners or a reputable think tank say that something is false. That works. However, again, how many institutions are now reputable for both political camps? That's not that many. So also some work shows that corrections included within the same article as the misinformation, or inoculating people against misinformation before they see it, is effective. So for example, an article may first say that some people think that Obama is a Muslim, and in the next paragraph say that that's not true. But misinformation spreads online long before it is corrected. And so these efforts are effective, but they're partially artificial as well. And a crucial challenge here, subsequent fact-checking sometimes works, but often, and there's some work as well that shows, does not erase the attitudinal effects of misinformation. So in fact, some argue that correcting misinformation may give it even more power and risk spreading it to an even larger audience. So in other words, merely repeating a rumor increases its strength. So given the challenges of correcting misinformation in the current political climate, and once it has been processed, what may work? So I speculate about two strategies: a micro-level strategy focusing on individual cognitive skills, and a macro-level strategy focusing on the system, and that one is more speculative. So the first is the micro-level strategy. So I propose that we attempt to alter the way in which people approach information in general. So for instance, including certain prompts or cues on social media or on websites of media organizations may perhaps encourage people to be more critical and process information in an unbiased way. So the work by Dave Rand at Yale shows that people who have analytical reasoning skills are more able to discern fake news from real news. So this work suggests that interventions that promote analytic and open-minded thinking can help prevent belief in misinformation. And in my own work, which focuses on selectivity and political polarization to a greater extent than on misinformation, I or my co-authors find that experimentally priming accuracy motivation, so encouraging people to be accurate when approaching information, or endorsing or emphasizing social norms of open-mindedness, may encourage partisans to look at balanced political content. So now I look at some other interventions focusing on positive affect, for instance, making people feel happy. The next step is to examine whether these strategies can help prevent exposure to, acceptance of, and the spread of misinformation. And let me emphasize that these strategies, so promoting analytical thinking, open-mindedness, accuracy motivations, or other mental states in the media exposure context, are content or issue neutral. So most of the efforts aimed at correcting misinformation is focused on specific content, of course. So in these situations, the corrections need to analyze the content, prepare the rebuttals, and so forth. And it's rather easy to say partner up with Facebook or with Microsoft to have banners on social media or some prompts encouraging people to be more critical or more open-minded, independent of an issue. And the second strategy to correct misinformation is the more controversial one. So this macro-level strategy focuses on the system and attempting to prevent exposure to misinformation in the first place. So how could we do this? So I speculate in at least about 2 ways, and as Pablo mentioned, it is extremely challenging, very difficult, but this is the more provocative statement of my presentation. So one could be identifying problematic sources and downplaying their importance, let's say in Google searches. And here the question is, who holds the authority to determine what is problematic and to identify those problematic sources to begin with? So the public would be and should be skeptical if, say, a private or public entity were to do that. But can the emerging artificial intelligence-powered collective filtering systems be an acceptable possibility? I know that some scholars and some platforms are working on that, so that could be a way forward. And another macro-level strategy would be to increase the cost of sharing misinformation. And by that, I mean actually finding media organizations or sources that purposefully spread false information. And this strategy is controversial in the US, where there is a huge emphasis on freedom, sometimes at the expense of public good. But for instance, in Germany, Facebook is required to take down hate speech at the expense of being fined. So that also relates to the three strikes and you're out comment from our first panel. So those are my ideas. And in the last minute or so, I wanted also to encourage us to carefully think of what it is that we're trying to influence as scholars and practitioners. So in thinking about corrective efforts, we may want to differentiate between the effects of exposure to misinformation on attitudes, on knowledge first. So what I mentioned at the start, the difference between knowing the real facts or the evidence, but nevertheless choosing not to believe it, versus on attitudes. So for instance, will knowing the real facts change my voting decisions, for example? Will it or will it not? We don't know the effects. And on such relevant behaviors as information sharing on social media. So to what extent do people share information that they know is false on social media, again, knowing that they are spreading misinformation? If they choose to share, knowing that they are sharing falsehoods, then corrective efforts that we might engage with should account for that as well, because then the rumors or misinformation may continue spreading despite various efforts to encourage people to have the correct evidence-based knowledge.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to respond to a couple of things that that both of you said, and I'm also going to offer 5 points, more than 3, but I've got 5 points that I want to talk about regarding misinformation. And to the first point, I want to tell a story about a time that I was misinformed. It started when I was a kid, and my mom would keep a jug of distilled water on the basement steps for ironing and for humidifiers and stuff. And I always thought, oh, the distilled water is like special because you buy it, it doesn't come out of the tap. And then when I was in about 9th grade, I had this really nutty science teacher who one day started telling us that the way that they make distilled water is they take a jug, or they take a canister of hydrogen and they take a canister of oxygen and they shoot them at each other. And that's where the distilled water comes from, because when you combine hydrogen and oxygen, you get water because it's H2O. And I didn't know any better. I was like, oh, okay, that must be how they make the distilled water. And I went about my business. And it never came up again, ever, until I was an adult. And my kid asked me about distilled water. And I was like, oh, well, you know, they like shoot the hydrogen and the oxygen from the canisters, and like that's what makes it. And he looks at me and goes, that doesn't sound right. And my husband looked at me and he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, that's what he told me in science class. And then I remembered that this particular science teacher had told me a number of other things that were totally wrong. And yet I believed him because I was 13 and he was a teacher and he was a science teacher, and I had absolutely no way of knowing otherwise because he was the expert who had been presented to me as an expert, who I was supposed to listen to him about how the world worked. And so I think about this incident of misinformation, when I think about how misinformation spreads, because many of us don't know what we are misinformed about. And it is entirely possible for intelligent, well-meaning people to be confused about things, the way that I was confused about the distilled water. And it didn't matter until it did, right? So I think about that, and then I think about expertise. I think about who do we trust as experts, and I trusted my 9th grade science teacher as an expert, but I clearly should have only trusted him as an expert in certain realms, not in the realm of, you know, chemistry and manufacturing. So I want us to think about who we trust as experts when we are talking about misinformation, because the source of the expertise matters a great deal. Okay, is it accurate? Well, it's accurate if it's coming from an expert. Well, people are not experts across fields. Okay, so like Elon Musk might know a lot about taking a payment company like PayPal public, but Elon Musk does not necessarily know anything about tunnels and infrastructure, and we should not necessarily assume that just because somebody is good at one thing, that they are also an expert in something else. It's an important point in understanding misinformation. I also want to talk about stickiness. So cognitive psychologists have done a lot of work on how do people perceive risk. All right, the psychology of risk perception is totally fascinating, and it has a lot to do with understanding the psychological processes behind misinformation. There's one cognitive psychologist who does a really great job. His name is Paul Slovic. He's out of Oregon. I totally recommend reading his work. He has a great book called The Perception of Risk. And one of the things that psychologists say is they talk about the stickiness, the difference in stickiness between anecdotes and statistics. So if I tell you that my cousin's sister-in-law's kid got killed by a falling television, you're like, oh my God, like, that's horrifying. And it's somebody who I know, and so you feel like you know me, and so you can imagine this poor little child, right? If I told you that 10 kids are killed every year from falling objects in the home, it wouldn't hit you the same way, right? The anecdote is more powerful because we're humans. We evolved as an oral culture. Human stories hit us harder and are stickier inside our brains than statistics are. Okay, so human stories are more sticky than numerical stories. So those are the first things I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about something that Magdalena brought up, which is the idea of fines for misinformation. I I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say about this, because I imagine it's a very controversial idea. But I want to talk about the idea of experimenting, because in technology, we talk a lot about moving fast and breaking things and experimenting. And what if, as an experiment, we treated platforms as publishers, right? What if we tried saying Facebook has exactly the same responsibility as the New York Times to make sure that what they're putting out there is true? So right now, there's a legal framework that allows Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, all of the platforms to avoid responsibility for what's published on them. And that clause is called CDA 230. Anybody familiar with this? Yeah, okay. So CDA 230 is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And it says that if you are a common carrier, you are not responsible for what people are doing on your platform. And this came about way back in the early days of the web. And it was designed to protect digital companies from being held responsible in the same way that, like, we wouldn't hold Verizon responsible for somebody making a phone call and like, I don't know, what's something mean you could do to somebody on the phone? Like, yeah, harassment. Okay, so like, you wouldn't say, oh, it's the telephone's fault or the telephone company's fault if somebody is making harassing phone calls. So tech companies, way back in the day, in the early days of the internet, said, oh, well, it's not really our fault. People are just going to use the internet for whatever they're going to use it for. Same way people use the telephone, whatever they're going to use it for. And it's the same thing. So we need to be held blameless. And so we put together this law. And so a lot of people are saying, all right, well, maybe it's time to look at CDA 230 and revise it based on how things have turned out over the past 20 years. So I'm not saying let's abolish it. I'm saying let's look at it and let's see if we can, use that regulatory framework to make us safer and see if we can do better around there. So that's one thing we could talk about. Another thing I want to talk about is the idea of the popular versus the good. So there are lots of things that are popular but not good, like racism or ramen burgers, right? And social media platforms and a lot of algorithms are set up to pick up on what is popular and amplify what is popular. And this has implications for misinformation, because the kind of misinformation that we call fake news is very popular, right? Like, it was very popular to say, oh yeah, Hillary Clinton is running a child sex trafficking ring out of a pizza shop in wherever, which is obviously crazy, but it was very popular. So our algorithms can't just amplify and spread what is popular. They have to also be tuned for what is good, because otherwise you just get dreck. Like, the algorithms don't make us better as a society. And if we're going to talk about the difference between popular and good, and we're going to talk about how algorithms work and how social media algorithms work, we also need a little bit more computational literacy across the board. And we need more media literacy across the board, and we especially need more media literacy among the people who make algorithms, right? So I'm a data journalist. That means I find stories in numbers. I use numbers to tell stories. I started my career as a computer scientist. I quit to become a journalist. And so I hang out with a lot of computer scientists and data scientists. And one of the things I've noticed is that they don't really understand the difference between different types of information. They don't think it matters. And they don't understand the news. Now, I think a lot about the news because I'm a journalism professor. So like, you know, perhaps I'm being unrealistic, but there seems to be a kind of blindness to nuance in information, and there seem to be a lot of people who believe that everything that's published on the internet is journalism, and it's not. There's a lot more nuance to it. So I think that the final thing that we can do, in addition to understanding more about the psychology of belief and risk perception, in addition to trying to treat platforms as publishers and seeing how that goes, in addition to keeping in mind the distinction between the popular and the good, and developing more media literacy and computational literacy, is we can keep in mind what computers can't do. So one of the ideas I talk about in my book is the idea of technochauvinism. This idea that technology is always the highest and best solution. And a lot of us seem to have this belief that somewhere out there, there's an automated solution that is going to fix the problem of misinformation. Right? When Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress, he said 30 times, we're going to build AI tools to fix this problem. We're going to build AI tools to fix this problem. And if there were a way to build AI tools to completely fix this problem, somebody would have built them by now. Like, AI tools are not going to solve the entire problem, right? The problem is going to be, or if we are going to attack this problem, it's going to be part humans and part computers, right? There's no fully automated system that's going to work. Thank you for that. So let's keep in mind what computers can't do, and let's design solutions that pull humans into the loop. All right? Let's design solutions that fit the way that we know society operates, the way that we know psychology works, the way that we know that political systems work, the way we know partisanship works, and let's start from there. So that's how I would say it. Thank you. So I want to ask a couple of questions. So Magdalena, you brought up the idea that some people are spreading misinformation on purpose, and you brought up the idea of vaccine deniers. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
What specifically? Which?
So people who spread misinformation, who know on some level that what they're spreading is probably not right, but they do it anyway. What's going on there?
So what I mentioned were two things, that there is a group of citizens, and I do not know how large that group or what percentage of the population, that, and maybe you can talk more about that, that knows the facts, that knows the scientific evidence, but chooses not to accept it or not to believe it. So I don't have numbers here. However, the vaccination example was just an example or an illustration of that. That there are individuals who may believe, or may know that there is scientific evidence for lack of association between vaccination and autism, but still reject that scientific evidence and choose not to vaccinate their children, for instance. Same would go for genetically modified food and some other scientific controversies that have evidence behind them, but people choose not to accept that. And so that's one thing. And second, as well, and no numbers here, maybe Pablo would have them, what's the percentage of people sharing misinformation knowingly? So they know that it is false, they know that it is incited to misinform, so it is aimed at misinforming, and they still share it. I do not know the percentage, but it seems to me that that is a a part of the sharing activity. In that particular case, when we aim at correcting misinformation, for both of those cases, when people have the facts but choose to reject them, giving them facts will not change their belief. So how will we target, how will we design corrective interventions that differentiate between knowledge and beliefs, or having the evidence or knowing the information and still believing the contrary? And the second thing is, how do we design interventions aiming at curbing the spread of misinformation on social networks? So if people share knowing that it is false, telling them that it is false will not lead them to share less, because they share in order to get more likes. You know, social media are all about being social and popular, right? So maybe I will generate more comments or more likes when I share something that's plainly false. So then again, how do we target interventions that recognize that it's not about lack of information, because people may have the information, they just choose not to accept it.
So I think that the sharing activity is a lot like the survey response that John was talking about on the first panel. So when we're talking about the survey response where people give like the partisan, convenient, false response, like, what is going on there? Is that cheerleading? Is that just for fun? Maybe the sharing behavior has the psychology of the sharing behavior is similar to the expressive survey response, and that's like a connection between those two literatures that I believe has been heretofore unexplored. The vaccine stuff just drives me nuts. It is the one sole area where there is good demonstrated evidence of this kind of behavior. So Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler did 2 studies, both pre-registered on big samples. This is a correct finding, right? It's this 10% sliver by construction, because I believe that they found the bottom 10% of people who believed in vaccines. They gave them pro-vaccine information. And what did these people do? They reported a lower intention to vaccinate. And you can imagine that this is not amenable to my hypothesis, and so I worked hard to try and break this finding. I downloaded the data. I'm like, this can't be true. This must be p-hacked. This must be not p-hacked. It is it survives every correction, multiple specifications. They replicated this study. They did it again. So this subset of people, when you give them this corrective information, they report lower intention to vaccinate. They also report higher belief that vaccines work. What? It makes no sense. So on the one hand, they report a lower intention to behave in a particular way. On the other hand, their belief in the efficacy of vaccines has gone up as a result of being told by experts that vaccines work, right? So the motivated reasoning literature uses the word reject a lot, and I think that we should stop doing that. It is categorically not true that people reject information in the sense that they update their beliefs about this thing. I really don't know what the intention to vaccinate survey question means for behavior. I'm not sure that there is a good correlation between the self-reported intention to vaccinate and the way that people behave in the world, but that is to be demonstrated, and no shade thrown on at all on the excellent study by Jason and Brennan on that point. But vaccines are also anomalous in this literature. The vast majority, hundreds and hundreds of issues in which people are presented information, they do not backlash. They update in the direction of information. And so we have a tendency to focus on these anomalous findings whereby people are motivated to reason, so goes the theory, against this evidence. But that is not the main story. The main story is that people respond in the direction of evidence.
So it sounds like I picked exactly the wrong topic to focus on. So let's talk about a sphere where corrections to misinformation is working. What are some of the social issues or projects that you feel optimistic about?
So I'd like to pick up this Facebook conversation because that same set of authors, Brendan, and I believe that Andy Guess is on this project as well. You can correct me, Pablo, if I'm wrong about that, where they have tested this Facebook approach of, it appears that you're sharing a story that has been tagged as false. So AI has, by which they just mean they took some conditional averages. Like AI is this nonsense bill of goods that people have told us that there's new statistical tools, that they're the same statistical tools repackaged. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. Whatever. They can make a guess, like machines can have a good guess. They have a good guess. It's not as good as maybe human coders, but they've got a good guess about whether or not we would agree that a story is called fake news. Then they can include a little warning on the story. Right at the moment of pushing share, they're like, I noticed that link comes from something that we have guessed is a fake news. Do you sure you want to share? And the sharing behavior goes way down, and people have this is an effective approach. Now, the question is this like an ethical thing is this like a suppression of First Amendment rights? I want to offer to you that it is not a suppression of First Amendment rights. Facebook's algorithm conditions us, right? When we see stuff in our feed, it's what our friends have shared, and that has an effect on our psychology. That's just been demonstrated. In fact, there's a famous study on Facebook where they perturbed that algorithm to learn about its behavior, and people were all up in arms. Oh, Facebook is experimenting on us. Wait a minute, you guys, their algorithm was already acting on us, and for goodness sake, isn't it good that they're learning about what their algorithm does by perturbing it a little bit, right? Okay, so their algorithm does act on us. It's of course appropriate that platform acts on us, and they have an ethical responsibility to have it be acting towards the good. So I think it is perfectly reasonable for their algorithms to do just maybe we found Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in Congress unsatisfactory, that he didn't somehow take enough responsibility. But I think that the approach of, hey, let's have Facebook tag stuff, that's going to work. I think that's hopeful.
Okay. And Magdalena, does this fit with your idea of downplaying problematic, downplaying problematic sources?
Yes and no, because the idea behind downplaying problematic sources is aimed at minimizing exposure to misinformation. So when people, we'll just carry with the vaccination example, when people type in Google, are vaccines safe, there's sources that would say no, they cause autism would appear on page number 10 of Google search. So that's in a way that people just not see information that's false. What you mentioned, and that's a second step, which is absolutely, I fully endorse, is minimizing the sharing of information once a person has already been exposed, right? So to minimize subsequent exposure by other people who are strong or weak ties on social media. So in this scenario, a person, an individual Facebook user has already seen a link or a video, and then that little window that opens to alert an individual just prevents that person from sharing and subsequent exposure. To my knowledge, and again, I'm looking here at Pablo, Facebook has experimented with that, and it has been found to be ineffective, but maybe I'm misremembering, but again, it's kind of what you, so it works. So, and that's another problem. All those, not all those, but some of those corrections or strategies work in experiments. However, again, when we think of the real world of exposure, the nuances of how people get their news online and offline, we do not have these neatly controlled settings that we have when we do experiments online or in the lab. And again, we need to start there to show what potential strategies may work. But then we need to see whether these strategies are realistic and ecologically valid in the nitty-gritty world of information seeking. So for instance, that unlikely sources correction, this is fantastic. But again, it's not very realistic that a politician who is on the right will correct President Trump. So again, it will work, that sort of correction, as we know from experimental evidence, but it's not likely to happen in the real world.
I wonder if it's also possible that studying the behavior and articulating the behavior changes the behavior. So maybe that maybe the fact-checking intervention did change behavior at first, and then people got more savvy about it. And so the behavior of the social media users changed, and then the results were no longer true. I want to ask you both, how do you curate your own social media feeds? Like, do you use all of the computational tools that are available to quell misinformation?
I've done that like check my feed thing to make sure that I'm following enough women. And
That's a good intervention.
I was shocked and dismayed. I thought that I was doing this in a gender-free way, and that was not true. So I've modified my Twitter feed accordingly. But I follow a bunch of political scientists and a bunch of statistics nerds, and they are pretty unified in their political leanings. So, Pache, the filter bubbles, disconfirmation.
Yeah, and actually, I have kind of another twist to that, which is, and also related to the filter bubble, I'm academically and personally very interested in exposure to dissimilar views. So how to encourage people from across the partisan aisle to see views of other people who you disagree with. And I realized that on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter among the 85%, and I'm not American, so among many more of non-Americans who are not on Twitter. On Facebook, I see a lot of information from President Trump, for instance. And I'm not following him on Twitter. I'm not following him on Facebook. It's actually my liberal friends who share his tweets at extremely high rates. So this, it's, that to me it's very interesting both practically and academically. What are the effects of these exposures? Because I do see information that in my case comes from across the partisan aisle, but it's already filtered through the perspective, the opinion of my in-group friends, right? So somebody could say, oh, look at this idiot, and here's the tweet. So again, what does that mean? Is this being, like I see information that's counter-attitudinal, but it comes from within the in-group. Is it still counter-attitudinal, or is it, as I think, only reinforcing my prior beliefs about certain issues or actors? So if we curate our exposures, we may see more of the out-group information, but again, it's likely to be filtered either through our friends or acquaintances, and later through our cognitive biases that you mentioned as well. So the effects of it may not be as democratically beneficial as people would hope they are. That first we give people more information, more facts, more truth, and then they believe it. Not likely. Second, we give them more dissimilar, diverse information, they will become more tolerant. Again, I don't think that's the case, because many people, as motivated reasoning framework shows, would just counter-argue and reinforce their prior views.
Right, but that's not what the experimental evidence shows. and I just have to rebut that idea that people counter-argue in such a way that the information is counterproductive. I have not seen any evidence that making a positive case for your point of view is counterproductive. If anything, it doesn't do anything. But in most cases, it helps. On the filter bubbles point, my co-author Andy Guess has done this great study in which he installs a browser tracker and then people are walking around the internet. And so you get to see what people encounter. And of course, many of the news links that people encounter come from social media sites first, right? That's how people find their way to journalistic content. And if you then scale, what are people seeing? People are, the vast majority of people are seeing stuff in the middle, right? And the vast majority of the media diet is purple, which should update your point of view on the prevalence of echo chambers, right? Most of us are in the middle, and that's fantastic. One of the frontiers of this research is how much are people hate sharing? We don't know the prevalence of hate sharing, and because it's really hard to train a classifier to be oh, the text above the link is positively valenced or negatively valenced. We don't have that yet at all, and so surely hate sharing takes place. Maybe some of you have done it, but we don't know whether or not that's the majority of clicks come from the pro-attitudinal version of the share.
And then also to build on what you mentioned about Andy's work, in Amsterdam, where I was prior to joining UC Davis, there is a similar project, a personalized communication project, where they actually developed a software plugin to track individual online exposure. So it's not only that majority of people are in the middle, but majority of the people do not go online to look at political content, period. So those who do, they are in the middle.
Right.
But it's actually still a minority of individual browsing activity. So actually at the University of Amsterdam, they actually shut down that, or they are this summer, that software plugin because it just wasn't generating enough variance in exposure. We can talk about that later. But again, this is also something to keep in mind when we're so worried about filter bubbles, misinformation. It's actually majority of American population is not online to consume news. They look at sports, they look at cooking, they look at cute cat videos, but definitely not at political or news content. So that's also something that puts our event in perspective, in a sense.
Well, I did this interesting thing with my Facebook feed and my Twitter feed, actually, where I went through and I used all of the tools to take misinformation out of my feed. So I shut off all of the advertising options. You can go in on Facebook and you can basically destroy your advertising profile. Like, so they make it very hard to get to, but you can Google it and you say, all right, I want to find out what my ad profile looks like, and you can edit it. So if you take all of that out and then you mute the people, you mute your crazy Uncle Rob, then it does actually do a lot toward getting rid of the misinformation. It's just that you have to want to do that. And it's not the default, and most people are not going to go in and spend the time declicking all of these little things. All right, so we do have time for some questions. What do people want to know about? Okay, gentleman in the black shirt right here.
My question is for Magdalena in reference to your idea of finding the providers. I recently saw a clip on YouTube of someone speaking at another forum, and I think this gentleman had been or is an editor of Time magazine. He was talking about the use of propaganda domestically, so not externally, and he was saying that it was a good thing and that every country does it. And so when you're talking about finding people for spreading misinformation, how does that apply to domestic use of propaganda or misinformation?
So again, I must emphasize that it was just a speculative idea that was meant to be provocative. And nevertheless, I do think that works also precisely in those contexts. And here, we run into all the challenges of how do we define misinformation? How do we identify the sources that spread it? But perhaps here, the differentiation in definition between disinformation and misinformation could be useful, because disinformation being content that's purposefully developed and shared in order to mislead. So there is a purposeful attempt. It's not just not knowing whether something is true or not, but purposefully sharing something, knowing that or creating something that you know is false. And in this case, identifying the sources, the websites, for instance, that do that, and finding them, could be an effective way of, maybe shutting some of them down, for instance. And again, whether is it, violation of First Amendment, I don't know. I don't think so. And that's something that's actually done in Europe, in several countries.
Great. Checkered shirt back there.
Thank you. It's a really interesting discussion. My question is about, this is something that Alex brought up about in the vaccination discussion about the intention to vaccinate and whether that actually reflects real behavior. It sparked a question, which is, how much does misinformation online, how much does that actually lead to offline behavior like voting or joining a protest event or not vaccinating? Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. So on the protest, I don't know if you guys saw this hilarious thing of somebody, there's 5,000 signups to protest at some event, and one sad person with a sign like took a selfie with the police that were like scheduled to be there. So anyway, it is definitely true that online behavior and offline behavior are not the same. With respect to voting, there is a great paper out by David Brockman and my soon-to-be colleague Josh Kalla, where they have taken approximately 50 experiments that were done in the real world, so not in the lab, like real campaigns that randomly did or did not try and persuade voters to vote for their candidate. And the summary answer from their work is, it doesn't work at all, right? So that the average effect of the mailers, the phone calls, the television advertisements is zero. Now, there are quibbles to be made with that study, but it suggests that some things like attitudes, that's what I've been trying to convince you all of, is that I can move attitudes. It's pretty easy to move attitudes. Write an op-ed, you move an attitude. It appears to be harder to change this stubborn behavior of voting for a particular candidate, although many things differ between those kinds of studies, and so the jury is really still out on whether or not we can move behavior. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Great. Right here in the red sweater.
Hi, Danielle Kelly, National Cancer Institute. So the thing that I've been thinking about the most is, over the past 4 years or so, the research in this area has really accumulated, and we've got a number of syntheses of the research. Like UPenn just had a conference in December on this, and the white paper is available. Highly recommend checking that out. There's a book edited by Brian Southwell and Emily Thorson on this matter that is a collection of research. And Meredith, your book sounds very interesting. I'll check that out for sure. But what do we do in terms of moving research to reality? Because as researchers, we tend to run all these experiments, but don't really think about how that applies in the real world. So how do we start bridging that gap, and what steps should we be thinking about moving towards that goal?
Well, I think clearly one of the answers is we have more panels at Brookings. That seems like step one.
I'm content to be a potty-hunted academic in the ivory tower and just learn things, but I understand that that's not in some sense I'm paid to do more than that. One obvious way to change the way the conduct of academic research is to do more field experiments. And so there's this growing movement in development economics, in some areas of political science to do field experimentation. It's the kind of work that I admire the most. It's the ones that policymakers and practitioners are like, that looks like what I do, and thank you for at least holding out a control group, and now I can see the effect of this. So I did a very cool collaboration with the DC Police Department here, where we randomly assigned the presence or absence of body-worn cameras. And so that was a policymaker-driven experiment, and the only thing the researchers were doing were flipping coins, right? And so this was the right kind of collaboration. And if any of you are in positions of power in which you'd like to know the answer to a real-world question, there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of hungry academics who would be willing to flip the coins for you. And so that's one positive thing I think that we can do to bridge the gap.
Absolutely. So I fully agree with that. And second, greater collaboration between nonprofits, for instance, and academics in field experimentation. Another, and that's not the crowd here, but another one is to alter the institutional incentives, because running field experiments is more time consuming than running, a lab or online experiments, for instance, and also collaboration with NGOs or other policymakers as an academic often comes at, it takes time that, say, could be devoted to yet another publication. And, the institution, being the university, values yet another publication, not necessarily the collaboration. So here would be also institutional change could, or in my view, is needed in order to cross the ivory tower and the real world bridge.
And I think there are two things we can, two very concrete things we can do. One is in academic publishing, we can speed up the publication cycle. So I publish both academic work and public work in journalism. And my journalism cycle is such that I can turn something in the morning and it's up by like 10:30 in the morning, right? And then I do, say, a book review for an academic journal, and they're like, oh, this is great. It's going to be out in a year. And I'm like, it's the same, like, I have just performed the same work, but why does it take a year to put this out in an academic journal? It doesn't need to take a year. So we could speed things up there. I think academics can also write in plain language, right? Like, you can write a complex research paper, and you can write it in the jargon of your field, but then how about also writing a plain language version? So places like The Conversation do a really good job of this, where they have a science writer partner with an academic and kind of translate the academic writing for a popular audience. More partnerships like that, where the science writers get paid, by the way, are really fantastic, and I think that would move the conversation forward. This has been an extraordinary conversation. Please join me in thanking all of our co-panelists, SSRC and Brookings.
So my AI just told me that these are awesome people we've had, and you should share them widely. So I want to thank you so much. Good scholars can be fair and balanced in the true sense of the term, even on difficult questions like truth and falsehood, information and misinformation. Again, I want to thank everybody at Brookings and the SSRC, John Sides, who did so much work helping to put this together. Thanks to C-SPAN, which will be broadcasting this, and thanks to all of you out there who have watched this. Brookings, I believe, will also be putting this up on our website fairly soon. We are considering, in the name of fairness, of organizing a new conference in defense of uncles and Velveeta cheese. And panelists will include uncles who like Velveeta cheese better than kale. I think we'll have a lot of volunteers for that. And last, inspired by one of the panelists, I am actually more a Deweyite than a Lipmanite. And so I wanted to close with a thought, again, from Christopher Lasch, reflecting on Dewey. Lasch wrote that if we insist on argument as the essence of education, we will defend democracy not as the most efficient, but as the most educational form of government, one that extends the circle of debate as widely as possible, and thus forces all citizens to articulate their views, to put their views at risk, and to cultivate the virtues of eloquence, clarity of thought and expression, and sound judgment. We have a ways to go to get there, but I think Lasch's goal would be better served if we engage each other and, yes, argue with each other on the basis not of falsehood, but facts, and information, not misinformation. We have a lot of work to do, and I'm grateful to all of these scholars for being so deeply engaged in it, and for all of you for staying for the entire session. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.